Hi, I'm Dr. Kevin Orieux. I'm the CEO of Aararat Consulting. If you're watching this video, then either you requested this from an email through our website, or you've seen one of our other videos that specifically had a link to this. This video is going to be about how Aararat Consulting uses the sciences of psychology and sociology in empowering management and leadership to create true synergy between the management levels and what we call the rank and file in corporate America. This is one of the biggest areas that prevents companies from being successful, is when there's a disjoint. And if you've been reading studies by Gallup or you've been reading Forbes, then you would know that the biggest problem facing the corporate world right now is that of disengagement, where depending on the studies, it shows that 71%, sometimes as high as 87% of employees are disengaged or actively disengaged from the very jobs they're supposed to be doing. And when our employees are not embracing what they're supposed to be doing and why they're supposed to be doing it and how they're supposed to be doing it, if they've got a kind of complacent, an apathetic, or even a despondent attitude about their work, then of course the company can't be as healthy as it could be and as it should be. So disengagement, conflict, and lack of teamwork are the three biggest challenges that those of you in management face as you attempt to get your people to do the things that they need to do, that they're supposed to do, that they were hired to do, and what they're paid to do. One of the biggest areas where there's a disjoint is the generational gap between the Millennials and Baby Boomers. And the reason for that is quite simple, because in most companies, you raise up in the ranks as you've got more experience and more years of loyal service. So in so many situations, those of us in management, like myself, we're Baby Boomers. And when you're a Baby Boomer and you're managing a bunch of people, then companies are constantly hiring as people move away or people retire, or for whatever reason, maybe the company's growing. So when we hire new people, it's usually the young generation, and the young generation, those are the Millennials. But in our society today, sociologically, there is a significant amount of angst and antagonism and adversarial mindsets between Millennials and Baby Boomers. And that's why we call this video Star Wars, the next generation, because one of the complaints that Baby Boomers have about Millennials is that Millennials come onto the job site thinking that they know everything. In their minds, a lot of Millennials, not all of them, but a lot of Millennials have this "I'm a star" mindset. Well, if they're a star, then we should be trying to make sure that they're happy and make sure they're satisfied. Isn't that what we do with stars and superstars and in movies or in sports? We got to make sure that we're pampering them. And that's the way a lot of Millennials kind of see work, is that their needs are supposed to be met. Well, Baby Boomers don't think like that. So when a Baby Boomer looks at a Millennial and the Baby Boomer's thinking, what a spoiled brat, or what we hear a lot in the literature is that Baby Boomers look at Millennials and say, where do they get this sense of entitlement, or why are they so self-indulgent? Remember, we're looking at it from the Baby Boomers' perspective now. The Millennials would have a completely different perspective. And we do not want to paint all Millennials with the same black brush. There's lots of Millennials that are extremely good workers. They're extremely focused on the task at hand. They're very good listeners. They want to be mentored. Lots of wonderful things about lots of Millennials. But if there wasn't a sense of entitlement with so many other millennials, then we wouldn't be reading about it in the literature, in business journals, in newspapers. So if a problem is repeated over and over again, the problem probably exists. So what is it that causes antagonism, angst, and an adversarial mindset between these two generations? Why are they almost at war with each other? And the reasons are psychological and sociological. And if you're watching this video because you saw a previous video where we said link to this training about the application of psychology and sociology using millennials and baby boomers, then this is the application that we were talking about in that video when we were saying that there's 3 types of managers that are not as effective as they could be, and all 3 of those types of managers are not effective because they've never formally been trained in the psychology and sociology of human dynamics. Well, here's the example that you were looking for. And if you haven't seen the video that I'm mentioning, at the end of this particular training, you will see a link, and we encourage you to watch it. It's very informative. It explains why your management team may be having difficulties or challenges, and specifically why at work you may have a problem with disengagement, you may have a problem with a lack of teamwork, and you may be dealing as a manager with conflict resolution on an almost daily basis, to the point that you feel like you're a playground monitor or some sort of referee. That link will be at the end of this video. But let's get on to the specific application of how do you apply psychology and sociology in management training to help people get along. As it relates to millennials and the way that baby boomers look down on millennials and say they're entitled, they're self-indulgent, they're self-centered, it's mostly because of the sociologically different environment in which millennials were raised. Well, different from what? Different from the baby boomers. And the difference is, baby boomers were raised by parents who lived through World War II and lived through a depression. When you live through a depression, as my parents did, the stories that I'm told by my parents and my aunts and my uncles and other people I know who lived through a depression is everybody had to work together, if for no other reason that you couldn't survive. Families had to work together. My father would tell me stories about delivering groceries on a bicycle for 12 to 14 hours a day, 6 days a week, believe it or not, in the snow. And for that many hours in a week, he would get paid $4.50. When he got paid, he would give that $4.50 to my grandmother to help look after the family. My grandmother would give my father back 50 cents of it. And his older sister, who fortunately also had a job, did the exact same thing. So back during the Depression, families worked together and families supported one another. You could call it teamwork. And they had to work together. Now at Aararat Consulting, we don't like the word team. We think it's a weak word. It's a word that doesn't really connect with people mentally. As a matter of fact, at Aararat Consulting, we say that team is a 4-letter word, and I've actually written a book on it. It's the worst word used in corporate management today. But back in the Depression, families worked together, communities worked together. Also, if we go to the parents of baby boomers, this is 100 years ago now. 100 years ago, people lived rurally. When you live in a rural community, the community works together. All you have to do is watch the Broadway show Oklahoma, and you can see how the people rallied together for a barn raising party. But that's what people would do. They would support their neighbors. If someone had a fire, everyone would pitch in to help rebuild their house or rebuild their barn. People relied on each other and people contributed to each other, and they did it selflessly. But there's also an expectation that if they were in need, that their neighbors would look after them. Well, see, that was for the parents of baby boomers and for every generation before that. 100 years later, as we become a more urban society, this is what our millennials were raised in. Our millennials were raised in a type of environment where you may not even know the names of the neighbors on your street. Back in the 1990s, someone by the name of Faith Popcorn, actually was her name, produced the Popcorn Report, and this sort of thing was labeled as cocooning. So what we do is we cocoon, or we're more insular. In other words, millennials were not raised with this same sense of community. This is why psychologically they don't really understand teamwork, because they've never had to work together in community to survive. Their psychology is formed by their sociology, and the sociology of the last 30 years is that people in urban centers cocoon and don't even know the names of the neighbors on their street. So if we expect millennials to be team players, they have no idea what the concept of working together means. And this is one of the reasons that baby boomers find millennials very aggravating, because millennials tend to go at it on their own and they strike out and do things their own way, and they don't ask for help and they don't ask for guidance. Why? Because they're stars, because that's what they've been told all their lives. But listen to this, they've been told that all their lives by their parents, who themselves are baby boomers. In other words, sociologically, there was a change in mindset psychologically about parenting, starting in the 1960s. Because after World War II, the GI Bill was instituted. And with the GI Bill, going to college or university was no longer one of the things that the privileged got to do. It became almost a right. The children of wartime veterans poured into universities and colleges across the Western world. And the baby boomer generation became the most educated generation the world has ever seen. Well, part of this education was the whole idea that maybe the way we raise children needs to be questioned. And the psychological phrase that came out of it in the 60s was, don't bruise the reed. And the reed was the child. Don't bruise the reed meant don't be so harsh. Now remember, parents were harsh or very much into discipline in every previous generation because every generation had gone to war. Parents had an attitude towards children that children should be seen and not heard, going back to Queen Victoria, as a matter of fact. But in the 1960s, it was like, no, let's let our children express themselves. Let's let them talk openly. Let's find out what they're thinking and what they're feeling. And this is the way we raised our children. So now, sociologically, millennials were raised with the idea that they didn't have to worry about interrupting adults because they were part of the group process. They were actually encouraged to speak out, so they did. And yet, when these now millennials come into the workforce, this same generation of baby boomers, the same generation as their parents, are suddenly upset with them because they speak out what's on their mind. Because while parenting philosophies may have changed, the hierarchy in the workplace didn't. So for many millennials, again, going into the workplace was a cultural and is a cultural shock. All of a sudden, it's like they're not allowed to talk. At least that's the way it seems to them. So as baby boomers, if we understand that children were raised with the idea that they could voice their opinion, that we asked for their opinion, that it wasn't a problem that they interrupted, because we stopped thinking, squelch them. We stopped thinking children should be seen and not heard. Well, if that's the sociological conditioning that millennials are raised in, of course they're going to bring that same psychological mindset into the workforce. And once we understand that cause and effect, it's much easier to be compassionate and understanding and yes, more considerate to how the workforce is such a cultural dichotomy from the family or the home. Now, another reason that millennials have this sense of entitlement is because they're the children of baby boomers. Not only were baby boomers the most educated generation the world's ever seen, also the wealthiest. Baby boomers, having gone to school, had an education which gave them good jobs, and after the Second World War, we had a post-war industrial boom. Everybody was working and everybody had the opportunity to make good money. When baby boomers had, and they weren't going without, they had good jobs, they were making good money, guess what they did? They indulged their children. And in the post-war industrial boom, these same parents of baby boomers got good jobs and they indulged their baby boomer children. So the whole idea of indulging our children is actually 2 or even 3 generations deep. So if as a child we're indulged, then why wouldn't we be indulged in the workplace? See, nobody ever explained to millennials, by the way your parents effectively spoil you and they drive you to soccer and they drive you to ballet and they give you piano lessons and they give you taekwondo lessons and they buy you whatever sporting equipment you might want and they take you on trips and all of these wonderful things you've got, nobody ever explained to millennials, by the way, it's not like that in the workforce. Nobody ever explained to millennials, by the way, when you get into the workforce, nothing's given to you, you have to earn it. You have to work for it. Is it a sense of entitlement with millennials? Or is it sociological conditioning? It's almost as though we've taken a generation, these millennials, with a completely different philosophical approach of their parents, a philosophical approach that was foreign to every generation before them. It's as if the millennials are from a different planet. Seriously, because we have been at peace for approximately 7 years, with the exception of the Korean War and the Vietnam War. By the way, neither of those wars threatened world security. Neither of those wars were on the home front. Neither of those wars threatened to take away our freedom. So with the exception of the 50s, 60s, and early 70s with Korea and Vietnam, we have been at peace for 70 years. And the millennials were raised and have lived in peacetime. And relatively speaking, they've lived at a time of not just peace, but great prosperity. So, if there's nothing threatening you, you don't have to go, sir, yes, sir, because it's not like you're about to die. And if you've already had things provided for you, pretty much everything provided for you, pretty much all the time, well then why wouldn't you think that you can get whatever you want whenever you need it just because you asked for it? Because that's what your whole life has been like. So a millennial can't understand why they can't get their vacation time from work in the middle of August. Well, that's when the people with more seniority get vacation time. Sorry, you're new on the totem pole. You'll be lucky to get 2 weeks in a row, but you certainly won't get them in the summer. You might get 1 week in November and the other week in February. So at Aararat Consulting, we have some very in-depth training that will help you understand the etiological or causative roots of this angst and this antagonism and even this adversarial positioning between baby boomers, who for the better part are in place of authority, and millennials, the next generation, where the millennials think they're stars and we're having Star Wars.